videos, you learned about instruments in the 19th century. In this video, we will explore spaces in which those instruments performed and the culture surrounding those performances. In 19th century Europe, and even America, music was performed in multiple venues. Some music was performed in private spaces, homes. Other music, however, was performed in larger public spaces such as churches, opera houses, or concert halls. The most intimate of the performance spaces were in people's homes, often in a room specially set apart for music and entertainment. Chamber music was a type of music developed in the 18th century for the entertainment of nobility or the wealthy. Sometimes this was also called salon music because of the room, salon, where the music would be performed. This music might be performed during a meal or as entertainment by itself for a small audience. Only those invited to the occasion would be able to attend these concerts. These were very privileged affairs. Young women and men of wealthy families might be trained as avocational musicians so that they could entertain the family. This also increased their value as marriage partners. The apparel worn on these occasions was usually quite formal. For this reason, the tradition continues for performers to wear tuxedos, such as the one I'm wearing here, or tails. Tails for men required a white vest, a white bow tie, and the tails themselves, which were long and black and have the tails here at the bottom. You might recall the formal apparel in the clip from the movie Amadeus. Also look closely at the costumes worn by the wealthy British classes in the video clip from Pride and Prejudice. Italy and France set the standards for public performance spaces in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Churches were the most common spaces in which music was performed. Admission to the churches was free, and consequently, this was the only place that peasants heard fine music by instrumentalists and vocalists. The premier public space for music was in churches. At weekly gatherings, there were more people who heard music by organ, choir, and other instruments than in any other place at that time. The other public places in Europe and the USA at that time were opera houses and concert halls. Churches offered free music for those in attendance, but most opera houses and concert halls would have charged money. Now let's take a look at the music presented at the Paris World's Fair in 1889. This lecture and the next is indebted to the research of Annegret Fauser in her book Musical Encounters at the 1889 Paris World's Fair. All of the music presented at the Paris World's Fair was available for the public for a fee. If one was seeking the most exciting musical performance, there was only one place to go: to the opera. First and foremost, it was opera that gained the most public attention. A ticket to the opera provided spectacles of staging, costumes, drama, music, and occasionally even dance. You'll be looking at a scene from Verdi's Aida in this course. This opera was staged on the third day of the World's Fair. Here we see the entry for Aida. Of all the music performed at the Paris World's Fair, it was opera that was the most popular. From May 1st to the end of the World Fair on November 10th, one opera, and sometimes even two or three, were performed each day or evening. Later in the next video, we will examine applications of technology at the fair. Notice that it was the opera, not other musical events, that was always featured in live telephone broadcasts. The public was fascinated with opera. Opera in those days was performed in the largest venues, often at night. As a result, the opera houses needed elaborate lighting systems. There was little use of electricity at that time in the 1800s for lighting. Most of the street lamps and lighting in the theaters were supplied by gas. However, brighter lights were needed for the stage. These brighter lights were called limelights, which consisted of oxyhydrogen flames directed at cylinders of quicklime. Let's watch this video that explains the chemical processes that produce the bright light.
Here I have this piece of quicklime. I grip it with these tongs. And now I will heat it with this welding torch. I will use these safety glasses. Look at the intense brightness. We almost can see the rest of the scene. Only the glowing stone. This kind of light, known as limelight, was used by the end of the 19th century. By the way, there is a film by Charles Chaplin called Limelight, because of that type of stage lighting once used in theaters and music halls. Without looking directly to the light, and as a tribute to the heroes of the limelight, see you soon.
It wasn't until a decade later that electrical lighting was common in concert hall and stages. Remember that in the 19th century it was materials, mechanisms, and even chemistry that were the primary means of innovation. What 20th century innovators did with electricity, 19th century innovators did with chemistry. Now, there were many other musical events at the fair which represent well the musical scene in 19th century Europe. Concerts for the general public were given, and their music often comprised of popular instrumental selections. You can see here the variety of different music given. Often they're just individual scenes from different works. This potpourri style of programming was fairly typical for concerts at that time. This differs from programming today by symphony orchestras that typically feature an overture and concerto in the first half of a concert, and then after intermission a full symphony. Here, the programming more often than not features shorter works or just a movement of a symphony. At the Paris 1889 World's Fair, music from different nations was showcased. Here we have music from France, but there was also Belgian, Russian, and even music from the USA. These featured composers from those nations and were exhibits of national pride. You can also see in this, actually in the USA program, here we've got an entire concerto and a suite, but it's got other songs and soloists here. The Russian program is interesting because it includes choir as well as dancers. Chamber music was also featured in the World's Fair. This music was for smaller groups such as piano and other instruments. You can see piano, violin, and cello. Here's violin and piano, oboe, and piano. Viola da gamba, that's an older version of the cello. So you've got some instrumental music. This would have been an intermission. So a fairly long concert with a number of different selections. Organ concerts were also quite popular. You can see the number of guest organists that attended that World Fair. The most unusual feature of the World's Fair was the inclusion of music from Africa and Asia. In particular, the presentations of the gamelan created great interest. This music from Indonesia and Vietnam featured the instruments with dancers. The famous French composer Debussy is known to have spent much time listening to this music at the World's Fair, and it greatly influenced some of his music. If you've been to a performance of an orchestra, choir, or band in an enclosed concert hall or auditorium, much of that experience is due to 19th century traditions developed in Europe. Perhaps you recognized many features discussed in this video. Please take the time now to view the video excerpts I've selected that portray musical performances in the 18th and 19th centuries. Try to imagine that you were at the events and what it would be like to experience music at that time.